Hi, this is Amit. Today's live stream is about Queen's Gambit Declined from Black's perspective. Many a time people ask me the question which is the best solid defense against d4, and I would say the solid defense against d4 is Queen's Gambit Declined. So let's start how to play Queen's Gambit Declined. d4, d5, white plays c4, and now black has various options, but the Queen's Gambit Declined starts with pawn to e6. It is blocking up the diagonal of black c8 bishop. Okay, so we'll even see like the variations where we'll plan out to develop that bishop lately. So usually that bishop will come out, but it will take time. So we are going to see the theory and then we'll see the strategies like how to come up with that bishop. So knight to c3, black plays knight to f6, white plays bishop to g5. He pins the knight, and which indirectly he pressurizes the d5 point. Now here we have to be careful, and the correct move for black is to play bishop to e7. Okay, now even knight bd7 can be played, and that is a completely different variation. So today we are going to see the Lasker defense, and we'll see how like the Lasker variation goes. Well, let's understand what happens if he plays pawn to h6. He will use removing the guard, and he will play bishop into f6. Now basically black has two options: either you capture with the queen or you capture with the pawn. If you capture with the queen, then you'll understand that the first defender, which was the knight, has already been exchanged, and another defender, which was the queen, is on f6. So now both the knight and queen is not defending, and already the pawn as well as the knight was pressurizing this point, right? So now white can simply play c into d5, e into d5, and knight into d5, and white will simply win a pawn, right? And this is definitely better for white. And if alternatively, if I think that after bishop into f6, if I play g into f6, so definitely I'm defending the pawn, so he'll not be able to capture my pawn. But then the thing is that the structure is very bad, right? In the opening itself, it's not better to play with this kind of structure. So that's why here bishop to e7 is a main move. Yeah, definitely knight b2 d7 is a completely different variation. So today we are going to focus on bishop to e7 now. Okay, now after bishop to e7, white plays knight to f3. Remember, this time bishop into f6 will not work. The reason is that if he plays bishop into f6, I will simply play bishop into f6, and still you can see that the queen is defending and my pawn structure is intact. Because the bishop was there, it was not necessary for me to capture with the g pawn. So that's why I captured with the bishop. My queen is defending d5 pawn. Indeed, if he captures it now, I'll capture with the pawn, and we are happy. We are very happy because still the queen is defending d5 pawn. At the same time, if you'll observe one thing, that I have opened up the diagonal of my c8 bishop, which is good for us, right? So the only problem which we saw very initially, which we discussed about, is that the c8 bishop is usually behind the pawn chain, right? So this is like one of the problems for black, which he has to solve in the upcoming moves. So if he captures, it will open up the diagonal of our bishop, and then it's definitely good for us. That's what we wanted finally. So anyways, here the correct move for white is to play knight to f3. Now after knight to f3, here there are various options for black. Okay, so here definitely you can castle, which is the flexible option, because once you will castle, then you have an option to play either c6, knight b2 d7, or h6. You have an option that either you play castle and then you play h6, or else you even have an option to play pawn to h6. And if you are playing Lasker variation, then this move is very important, and we'll come back to that, like later on we'll see that why this move is absolutely important. So bishop to h4, so h6, bishop to h4, short castle, pawn e3. As I mentioned, even he wants to open up the diagonal of the bishop. Black should play knight to e4. b6 will go into a famous Tartakor variation. This is also one famous variation. But why I'm showing you this, because Lasker defense is considered to be one of the most solid, a good variation for black, which will give you a solid options to continue. And remember, this was the variation which has been played by Vishwanathan Anand against Topalo in the World Championship. That was one very famous game where he implemented the same variation, the Lasker defense. So once a legend like Vishwanathan Anand has played it, in that too in the important game in the World Championship, right? So that means it just assures you that this variation has to be good. Okay, and maximum player, when you will play this, they are going to play bishop into e7. Remember that thing, queen into e7. The most frequently moved over here is rook to c1. Okay, but if he plays this, knight into c3, b into c3, and simply capture this one, d into c4, bishop into c4, and pawn to b6. Let's say if he castles, you are simply going to play bishop to b7. So remember, the bishop which was usually behind the pawn chain is now on an active diagonal, right? You can play knight b to d7, and later on you can always play pawn to c5 and open up the center if you want. So b6 bishop to b7 is good according to this position. So in this case, I don't think there is any kind of a problem for black, and black will easily equalize in this position. Okay, so bishop to d3 is quite simple, and that makes the life easier for basically black. So here the most frequently played move is rook to c1. So either you can play pawn to c6 or you can play knight into c3. You can straight away play knight into c3, rook into c3, and now you will play pawn to c6. So basically center control and development is very important. So with that principle, if you keep that in mind, like bishop to d3 seems to be a very natural move and quite oftenly played. The reason is that bishop to d3 is having influence on center, and it is vacating the squares between the king and rook such that white can castle short. Knight to d7, then castle. So you have an option to play d into c4, right, and then transpose into the position, because even after d into c4 he will play bishop into c4. Yeah, he can play rook into also, but like most of the time bishop into c4 seems to be very logical. And then now you have to play knight to d7, right? This is what you have to play. And now there is a bifurcation. The most frequently move is what he has planned, that is short castle. Okay, and then even just after explaining the idea, we'll quickly go through queen c2 also, because the idea might be usually similar. Now it is about development of this bishop. So you have to make a plan that how to get this bishop out. So there are two plans. Either you can go with e5, and in this situation definitely the idea is that you opened up the diagonal of the bishop. So knight is a piece, right, which you can always move. So that's why I showed you Lasker defense is basically here you can use e5 or c5, which are the typical breaks. So either e5, and another idea is what even Vishwanathan Anand used in the world championship match, which I spoke already. Like I mentioned about the world championship match which Anand have won in past against Topalo. In one of the critical games he used an idea of b6, which few of the viewers figured it out. b6, bishop to d3, and then c5. He plays bishop to e4, and that's the reason why he played this. His idea was that because he knows that this diagonal can be very important for you, so he will come over here and he will play bishop to e4. Okay, definitely he can even play queen to c2. And here you can see again the thing which I spoke, why absolute necessary was to play pawn to h6 in the Lasker's defense, right? Because if you would have not played h6, what would have happened is that now you would have required to play pawn to h6, right, and you would have wasted a move. And at that time, because his bishop was there on g5, so when you played pawn to h6, it was mandatory for him to save the bishop, right? So that was the reason. You can just see, at that time also I explained the same thing, but now because the position came here, instead of playing pawn to h6, because you have already played that, you are able to play bishop to b7. So small things might create a big impact in your game. Remember that thing. Finally, what good players do is that they accumulate the small advantage, right? And those accumulation of advantages in turn helps them to gain a winning position where they just break through. And if you have a good position, chances are very high that tactics will come in your favor because you have an active placement of pieces. So even if the tactics come, it might, but definitely you have to be alert with your opponent's move also. But yes, if you have a good position and if you accumulate the advantages, the probability of your winning increases usually. Okay, so bishop to e4 and rook to b8, queen to c2, and your idea is that you want to attack the bishop. And if he plays d into c5, which he will play, knight into e4, right, because even this bishop is a good bishop. So first exchange it, knight into e4, queen into e4, and then b into c5. Okay, then he usually plays something like queen to c2, and you can play bishop over b. Okay, remember, if he plays this, in that case it will be bad for him. I mean, even though you have given up that pawn, but remember this will come, right? So that would simply open up his position, and now you have a simple and a good move in this position. So what do you think? Okay, let's say if this position arrived in your game, what you would have played? Rook into b2, queen into b2, and you regained the pawn with a better structure, right? You have just destroyed his pawn structure over here, right? So you have a better structure definitely, and black is slightly better in this position if he plays in this way. Okay, now what is the logic basically? If I just see this thing and bishop, what is the logic behind this? The logic is that it says that okay, black has two isolated pawns over here and one is on an open file, but what compensates this thing, why still this position is considered to be equal, is because you have a bishop and the bishop is on an open diagonal. So you have an active bishop now compared to his knight. So first of all, you have a better minor piece, and second thing is that because of that you have a better activity. Now there is another way to play the same opening, and I'll come back to that. So here even e5 is a good move, right? So after castle, like when he castled over here, I mentioned that there are two ways to play this position. One is like, we just analyzed is that you play b6, you play pawn c5, bishop to b7. This is one way. Another way is straight away you can go for pawn to e5. So this is another way how you can play. So here he will play bishop to b3, or he can play d into e5. If he play d into e5, play knight into e5, knight into e5, queen into e5. And this position is already, what you can say is that black has equalized over here. The reason is that you are successful in opening up the diagonal of the bishop. So he has the king side majority, you have the queen side majority. But then the thing is that why queen side majority? Because both of you have castle salt. So your queen side majority might help you in the king and pawn endgame to create an outside passer, right? And outside passer can be a determining factor, and many a times it might help you to win more games. Okay, so let's come back to this. If he plays queen to c2, what should black play? And few of you already answered that you can play e into d4, and that is correct. You can play e into d4, and you also have an option to play pawn to e4. So both the options are open. But here remember, here he can play IQP, but he has gained the activity over here. The thing is that the rook is always ready, to attack your king side. So in that matter, you have to defend a bit if it is required. So you can play this. It's not a problem, but white might attack you in this position. So you have to be alert and you have to defend it actively. So it is possible quite. But yes, what you can do is that just try to trade pieces, because IQP, okay, usually in isolated, so this is all in all a different pawn structure and it needs a completely different study. But just to brief you over here is that IQP is usually good for activity, usually, like, it provides an active position, but here two minor pieces are already been traded, so that is one of the factor. And second thing is that it is good for attack, but then it is bad for defense. The reason is that if you are able to maintain this structure till the end game, in that situation this pawn can be a liability for him, because finally it's an isolated pawn, which is a pawn weakness in the end game. So yeah, yes, it's a struggle between the statics and dynamics. So dynamics is in white's favor, statics is in black's favor, right? So statics and dynamics are like, static is a long term advantage and dynamic is a short term advantage, but that doesn't mean that it is small. A drastic attack, right? Attack is a dynamic advantage. I'm just giving you an example. So a drastic attack can simply finish off the game in few moves if the attack is very drastic. I'm not just speaking about this position, I'm speaking about dynamics in general. Okay, so it is not that a short-term advantage is like, a dynamic advantage is small. It is the position which determines that whether the dynamic advantage is more, or the static is more. So let's say you are up a piece, that is, or you have a structural advantage which is a long-term advantage, that is static advantage, right? Even that is sufficient to win. And many a time if you have a drastic attack, even if you are down a piece, but if you have a drastic attack, let's say an example of Greek gift, or you sacrifice something for a winning attack, right? So you're giving up a piece, but then you have an attack, even though that is like, that attack, if you don't play properly, if the attack is diluted, you might lose the game. But if you have calculated properly and if you give any kind of sacrifice, that will just finish off the game. Okay, so this is one variation. Either you can play this, or he can definitely capture with the knight. That is one of the option, or you can push the pawn. Another option is that here after e5 he can play bishop to b3. You have the same set of options which we already discussed. Either you can play pawn to e4, or you can even play e into d4. So again, if you play a into d4, he can play knight into is again possible, but he can even play a into d4, and he can play the IQP structure where you will play knight f6, rook e1. As I said, he will get the attack knight e5, and his rooks are already ready to jump up over here. So even if you play knight to d5, his rook will come over here. If you defend properly, still I feel that this position is defendable, but then we have to be very careful over here. Yeah, but if you defend properly, bishop e6, I mean, you're completing the development. If you defend properly, it is good, but see, his attack is started coming, queen h5. So very, accurate defense is required. Any slip of move will just, finish you off. So yes, if you are confident enough about calculating your opponent's move, this is one of the option. But I'll give you another option too. You can even play pawn to e4, and this is also one of the option. Because you are attacking his knight, he has to play knight to d2, and then you can continue with knight to f6, right? So just remember this position. Here you have two options, but remember there are few other options too which have been tried. Like here rook e8 has been tried. Here in this position rook d8 has been tried, e4 has been tried, and e into d4 has also been tried, right? So all of these are possible option which you can think of. So definitely even a5 has been tried, right? And after e4 you attack his knight, so he has to go back, and you can play knight to f6, right? So this is a typical move which you can play. Now after this move, what you did is that you opened up the diagonal of the bishop. He plays something like queen to c2, the game will continue. Again, you have various options over here. You can play like rook to e8, bishop to f5. But remember one more thing is that he can, he has this move also. Like, this move can just increase the attack. What it will do is that it will attack you, and it will also increase the attack over here. So the knight and the queen is already attacking you. So this, just keep in mind that even this is possible. So this maneuver, like, you just have to keep in mind. So here there is another. So apart from what you mentioned, bishop f5, rook e8, or like, few of you were mentioning different options, or a5. So here there is another move which you can consider, and that is bishop to g4. This is also a considerable move. Now let's say if he plays rook to c5 with the same idea which I mentioned. So as few of you mentioned, the correct move over here is knight to d7. So you are hitting up the rook, but at the same time you are not allowing him to play rook to e5 also, right? So that was his idea, basically to play this and this over here. So we just anticipated the idea, and this also shows that why, anticipating your thinking about your opponent's possibility is important. You should always think that why my opponent has played certain move. Like in each and every move, try to think that what is the idea behind his move, and try to inculcate those things in your calculation. Like, because here we anticipated that rook to e5 is his idea, and that's why we can come up with the move like knight to d7, that not only attacks the rook, but it even stops him from playing, rook to e5. If he goes back, in that case you can play bishop to e2 and rook to c1, and then he moves the rook basically, and then you will play bishop to d3. If he plays something like rook to a5, again you can use the same idea. So basically that's not at all a problem. Queen c3, and you can go for c5 now. So I think this gives you the fair idea like how to play. Here also I'll just show you one variation, that if you go for c5 over here, so like you can definitely play as you wish after this, because it's already been, like, we are on move number 20 now, and that too in a solid opening, right? So I mean, this is sufficient for you. And definitely if you want to study more, because it's always better to study more, right? So in that case, what you can do is that you can study the games of the grandmasters who has played this opening. So you can study those games, and that will give you more ideas and various strategies to play in this kind of opening. Like here you can go for c5, an interesting move. He captures, and here definitely you can't capture it now. So here you can go for rook f2 c8, or even rook a2 c8, but then the thing is that here it is hanging. So there comes another variation over here where you gain the activity basically. Another thing is, if you don't want to give up the pawn, simply play rook f2 c8. So what I did is that I simply played c5 to open up the game. He captures, play. So this was a temporary sacrifice and you are going to regain it. He plays bishop to d5. I'm even showing his moves. So he plays this. Simply play knight into c5 and now the game will continue, right? So that's it for the day, my friends. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.